Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Naval Academy Museum Shifley Lecture series, and thank you to the class of 1950 in recognition of Vice Admiral and Mrs. Ralph Shifley. Welcome to everybody who's looking at this on YouTube and Facebook, as always. The last Shifley's lecture of the semester will be presented by the visiting class of 57, Chair Dr. Bill Trimble, who's actually with us today. We'll talk about Admiral John S. McCain Sr. and naval aviation from 1930 to 1945. Jamie Malanowski is a writer and editor, member of the original staff of Spy, where he worked for 7 years. Jamie's also been an editor at Time, Esquire, and Playboy, where he was managing editor. Jamie has also written for The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, The Washington Monthly, and The New York Times. A novelist and nonfiction writer, his most recent work, the biography of Commander Will Cushing, Daredevil Hero of the Civil War, was published by W.W. Norton in October 2014, and he's got some books for sale if you'd like to stick around afterward. And I should say, as part of this introduction, something I wouldn't normally talk about. Anybody who's worked in the Pentagon has probably hit their head against the wall so many times they've got a dent in it, just dealing with the bureaucracy and watching the entire process. What I actually wasn't aware of when Jamie and I started talking is that he wrote the screenplay for one of my favorite movies called The Pentagon Wars with Kelsey Grammer and Cary Elwes. If you haven't seen that movie, it's not a comedy, it's a documentary. And there have been many nights where friends of mine and I who have worked at the Pentagon, or one of the minor functions thereof, had a bottle of scotch and just shook our heads and said, they got that right. So Jamie, welcome to the Naval Academy, and we very much look forward to your talk. And I should add, before Jamie starts, since a few of my students are here from my naval history class, we just finished talking about the Civil War. He'll talk about Will Cushing, but I should note we talked about the North and the South and brothers fighting against brothers, but in this case, there were brothers who fought for the Union. Of course, that's Will Cushing to the right. That's his brother Alonzo Cushing to the left. He was a graduate of West Point, just received the Medal of Honor in October, I think. Was that right, Jamie?
First week of November.
First week of November, thank you. And what's interesting is that Will Cushing is, of course, buried here at Hospital Point at the Naval Academy, and his brother, who was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, was buried at West Point. So, without further ado, Jamie, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. You know, it's funny, my brother works in military procurement, and he took a seminar, and they showed the Pentagon Wars as part of the seminar. And I said, holy smoke. It's funny when you write a book, you live with the character, you live with the subject for a couple of years, and you think you know and have explored him from every angle you can think of to explore it. But then afterwards, the character lives on, and you learn more about it than you think. And a couple of weeks ago, when Leonard Nimoy died, they were showing the Star Trek movie that was made in 2009, the reboot of the series, in which Nimoy had a small cameo. But essentially reintroduced all the characters, and they reintroduced James Kirk from a very young age, and before he entered the Starfleet service. And they portrayed him, his father died when he was just hours old. He was rebellious, he was a maverick, he was vain and arrogant, he kept getting into fights, he thought he was smarter than everybody else, and yet was an underachiever wherever he went. I said, holy smoke, this is Will Cushing. They have based this on Will Cushing because Will Cushing was raised in Fredonia, New York by his widowed mother, one of 5 children. He was the youngest son. He had a sister who was a year younger than he was, but by the time, but that was Will's upbringing. He was always getting into fights. He was always up for adventure. He was always taking risks. He was always the guy who to pull snakes out of the snake hole, to drive the wagon down the steep hill, to take the boat out on the lake when it was terrible weather, and breaking rules, getting in trouble for making mischief during church services. He won A classmate wrote a memoir of him that when he was about 12 years old, they were at a general store, and a man came up and began to go after Will because he'd been stealing apples from his orchard, and he made a move on Will, and Will picked up an axe handle, hit the man over the head, and then ran away by running along the rails of a fence, which showed some nimbleness and balance. In any event, but like Captain Kirk, he found himself in the service and straightened out in the service, and the only thing that he had to do was avoid being squelched by the Naval Academy. Ma Cushing came from a pretty well-connected family, although she was, genteelly poor. They were related to Miles Standish, who came over with the Pilgrims and was connected to the Adams family. And so she had some familial connections, and one was a congressman, and one was a Captain Smith, who was at the time a commandant of the Washington Naval Yard. And between the congressman, who was a member of the short-lived Know Nothing Party, and the commandant, she wheedled appointments for her two younger sons to the academies. Alonzo to West Point, Will to Annapolis. At the time he entered Annapolis in the class of 1861, he was the youngest member of his class, but he was so young that not until he became a senior, he was the youngest student in the school. And I guess to distinguish himself, he became the biggest slacker in the school. If you go through each class roster, he's always at the bottom. He's always ahead of the ones who got dropped out, but he was always ranking right at the bottom. He just led in nothing but demerits. In his sophomore and junior years, he had close to 190 demerits, and expulsion came at 200. Perhaps it still does, I don't know. But in any event, he always stopped just short. He excelled at one class, which was gunnery, ranked third in his class. It was taught to him by a Lieutenant Flusser, whose name will come up in the story again. But he really related to Lieutenant Flusser, who really managed to bring out the best of him. Will was very committed to the idea of a naval career. He just thought he was too cool for school. And it was really shown between the summers, in summer between his third and fourth year, when the class took a three-master out, and they went across the Atlantic. They visited Spain, and they all had practical experience in running the ship and taking the watch, and he loved it. He took the ship through a storm. He loved seeing the foreign ports. He was more committed to a naval career than ever. And returning to the academy in the fall of 1860, during that time of the election of 1860, a lot of turmoil and ferment, the winds of war were in the air. He knew that it was very likely that he would be, in service very soon. A lot of his classmates were dropping out. It was a tumultuous time. And he reacted by not being very serious about his studies whatsoever. He continued to play around and fool around. He loved being pranks. He ran afoul of a Spanish teacher who he was sitting there in class, obviously sketching while the teacher was speaking. And when the teacher, Professor Roget, went over to see what happened, Will had drawn a picture of a donkey, and it said, "Professor Roget, sketched from life." And this annoyed the professor quite a bit. But who it really annoyed was the superintendent of cadets, of midshipmen, I'm sorry, a Lieutenant Commander Rogers. Lieutenant Commander Rogers was Navy royalty. He was like the crown prince of the Navy. His grandfather and father were both captains that served in the Revolution and the War of 1812. He married a woman whose grandfather and father were Navy captains. His uncles were Oliver Perry and Matthew Perry. So he took things very, very seriously. And it was at a time when there was a lot of turmoil within the Navy between a very traditional upper crust of very senior men who had all been in the Navy for 50 years, ever since they were cabin boys, who were very reluctant to change. And many of them were well past their prime. A number of them were alcoholic. The phrase, "he's a good man when he's not drunk," was heard quite often. And Professor Rogers, Lieutenant Commander Rogers really took this job at the Academy to kind of reform from within, to build a better class of naval officer starting from the bottom. And when he looked at Will Cushing, he saw someone he didn't really think was ought to be a part of that class. And so one thing I was able to do for the book is find letters between him and the Commandant, Captain Blake, who was the old school and was more lenient with the boys. It wasn't that he bent the rules. Well, he kind of bent the rules. I mean, the sense was, you could, if they knew people were up past curfew, sometimes they would break in and give demerits. Sometimes you'd break in and just lecture the fellows, knowing full well that there were 4 guys under the bed, but not really punishing them necessarily. And the same with, the fellows had slipped out at night, and you gave them a good chase over the wall, but you didn't quite apprehend them. And he thought he understood that these were young men. They were full of energy and spirit, and the school itself was, in the words of Admiral Dewey, in his memoir, was just a terrible grind. It was nothing but academics. There was no gymnasium, there were no sports teams, there was nothing for the students to do. And so I think Captain Blake had a sort of understanding that, they were going to blow off some steam, and you had to sometimes look the other way. But Lieutenant Commander Rogers really wanted to run things more tightly, and he complained about Will quite a bit, said he had a talent for buffoonery, which I thought was such a splendid phrase. And then Will played right into his hands in January of 1861. In his senior year, he failed his Spanish midterm. And Rogers used that as the pretext for getting him to resign from the Academy in March of 1861. Will's cousin, Captain Smith of the Navy Yard, was outraged. He said, "Can you imagine getting kicked out for reasons academic and not nautical?" And it was kind of true. People had been kicked out of the Academy, expelled, asked to resign for failing gunnery, for failing seamanship, for failing navigation, the stuff that had to do with the job. Nobody ever got kicked out for failing a Spanish midterm. And moreover, he had not reached the magic 200 demerit number. Nonetheless, he was asked to go, and in March of 1861, he resigned. His cousin got him an interview with the brand new Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. And Welles later wrote in a memoir about it that he said, "I took one look at this sad-faced boy, and I just knew that his heart was in the right place, that he was just too full of spirit and creativity, and that he was bored over there and kept getting himself into mischief." And Welles, who was the father of 4 sons, had sort of more insight into this young man's temperament than these officers who worked with him. But Welles knew that he could not overrule the officers in charge. But it's an ill wind that blows nobody some good, and fortunately for Will, war broke out. And so Welles was able to reinstate Will in the Navy at the lowest officer's rank and a master's mate, and Will was begun on his career. He served for about a year in doing kind of, I guess, the drudge work that low-level officers do, taking back, a lot of inspections. He served in the Chesapeake and on the Rappahannock rivers, stopping blockade runners and inspecting ships and liberating slaves that he found on them and so forth. Hard work. But after about a year, the Navy expanded. They needed officers. He was promoted to lieutenant, and his first assignment was with his old friend Flusser. And he really distinguished himself on their first mission. It was a combined Army-Navy mission where the Flusser's ship was to go up this sneaky Blackwater River in Virginia, and an Army group was supposed to advance, and they were supposed to trap a Confederate force between them. And you may be amused to know that the Army just never marched. And it left their small ship trapped in this terrible, in this dense, overgrown, hard to navigate river. A lot of it, they were using ropes to move around. And so the Confederates turned around and attacked them. And they were in very poor position to defend themselves. However, they had a lot of supplies roped to the sides of the ship that they were supposed to give to the Army when they met up with them, and a howitzer was on it, and Will stepped out in the line of fire, cut the ropes on the howitzer, and turned it on the Confederates and repulsed the attack. And it was the first time that Will was mentioned in official reports and cited for his heroism. And it was interesting that when, in the period after Will had to leave the academy and was waiting to see the Secretary of the Navy, he stayed with Flusser in Washington. And Flusser gave him a little book called, about the Navy called Naval Excellence. And it was basically a kid's book. It was a little square book that had many little stories of naval heroes, many of them from the age of Nelson, but dating all the way back to Greeks and Romans, and with a lot of colorful illustrations. And it kind of had a positive effect on Will. And I think Flusser realized something that Rogers and the others never really knew, which is that you couldn't make Will Cushing do anything, but you could inspire him to do anything. And Flusser knew how to push that button. In deference to the fact that you all have to go out and get an education soon, within the hour, I'm going to skip over some parts of this, but over the next 2 years, Will distinguished himself with adventure after adventure, fighting in Virginia and then down in the Carolinas. He had one escapade after another that read like comic book adventures. You know, one of his commanders wondered what the Confederate commander on the Cape Fear area was thinking. Will got in a rowboat with a bunch of men, rowed over in the dead of night, raided the thing. Turned out the commandant had just gone away, so they captured his adjutant, brought him to breakfast the next morning. He was sort of a real pioneer in behind-the-scenes warfare. He was always taking these small little vessels, rowboats, tugs, up the rivers, into the bayous, capturing a blockade runner here, destroying a salt mill there, liberating slaves, stealing the mail and bringing the intelligence back. Sometimes he'd go out looking for things. Once he got caught in a hurricane. Very adventurous story of how he brings his ship, steers his little ship through that. It's one tale after another, and over and over again he's demonstrating this intrepid spirit, this kind of can-do leadership, this ability to kind of size up a battle situation on the fly and make decisions. There was a period of time when he was being chased out of the Cape Fear River. This is like a pursuit in rowboat. He was in a rowboat, a big boat. I mean, 18 men are rowing him around, but he's being pursued by 6 Confederate rowboats equally filled. And they're rowing, and he sees the current changing, and like on a dime, like a point guard in basketball or a running back in football, he reverses, and all the pursuing boats overshoot him. He catches the current and is 100 yards ahead before they can turn around, and he gets away. And in just that same way that a point guard in basketball knows who's trailing him, or Wayne Gretzky could see somebody coming into the play and make these very precise passes, he over and over again was able to size up a situation and with great extemporaneity and snap decision making, make these very smart decisions that kept working out for him. Which brings us to the main event. In 1864, the Navy was finally moving against North Carolina. The blockade strategy of blockading all the Confederate ports, one by one, they were taking out the key ports. They took out the easy ones in Florida and in New Orleans and Norfolk. North Carolina was really hard to move against. It's a hard state. It's got the mountains on the one side. It's got all this coastal stuff, lagoons, bayous, bays, and it made it an ideal place for the blockade runners. And then they would cut up these lateral rivers to the railroad heads in Plymouth or New Bern or I'm drawing a blank, but to the towns there, and then the goods would be sent up to Wilmington. It would be sent up to Lee's army in Virginia, and so after Norfolk fell, the Confederacy lost the terrific port that they had there, and so they kind of, but they were still enamored with the idea of ironclads, of building ironclads and trying to replicate the victory that the Virginia had over the Union fleet on the first of the 2 days in March 1862. And so they kind of started building ironclads all throughout the South. Most came to nothing. I mean, they were built poorly, they sank, they used rotten wood, they never amounted to anything. But one fellow built an ironclad in a field in Tarboro, North Carolina, which is a pretty amazing feat in itself. He had the help of a Confederate captain named Cook, who was called the Ironmonger Captain. He went out and got every door hinge and lady's brooch and anything that he could find that was made of metal, melted it down, and they made the iron sides for the CSS Albemarle, which was a pretty big ship, 180 feet long, 50 feet wide, had 2 big cannon on it, and most terrible at all for what they intended to do, a big iron beak in the front that they meant to ram ships with and sink them. In April of 1864, they brought the ship down from the Tar onto the Roanoke River with the plans to hook up with a Confederate Army force and retake Plymouth that had been back in Union hands since 1862. Had a lot of trouble getting the ship down. It navigated poorly. It was a big beamy vessel. They had to turn it around at one point and bring it down backwards. But they finally got it into the Roanoke River, and by that point, the Union Navy had gotten wind of it. They sent up 2 of their finer ships, the Southfield and the Miami, to stop them. And their plan, they set up a big net between them, and their plan was to kind of wrap up the Albemarle in between and then board it and slug it out and take the ship that way. Captain Cook, in charge of the Albemarle at that point, was a little too smart for that, and he came in at an angle and just ripped the guts out of the Southfield and ruined that plane immediately. Kind of took it too far in. Right away, both ships sank, and it might have been the end of the Albemarle right then, except the Roanoke was relatively shallow and the ships bounced, and he was able to dislodge himself from the wreck of the Southfield. He bops back up, and the Miami is continuing to fire away at them, making no penetration of the armor whatsoever, but undaunted, they keep firing. At one point, the captain of the Miami takes over the firing, aims a shell, hits the side, the shell bounces back, lands at his feet, blows him to smithereens. That was how Charles Flusser met his end. So he died there. Eventually, the captain of the Southfield had boarded the Miami, disengaged, pulled away, and right away, Albemarle was able to join the Confederate Army forces and retake Plymouth. If you go down to Plymouth, North Carolina, they celebrate that day every year. In October, they modestly mark Will Cushing's adventures, but they celebrate the liberation of Plymouth from federal forces. So Braxton Bragg, the incompetent general in charge of Confederate general in charge of North Carolina, says, let's take this show on the road. We like the outcome so much, we'll take the Albemarle back down to Albemarle Sound, bring them down to the Neuse River, send them up, and we're going to liberate New Bern. This will be a fabulous idea. We'll just reenact this thing. So 2 weeks later, the Albemarle kind of waddles down, and just at the point of Albemarle Sound, gets met by 7 Union vessels. Obviously, they got word of this, and they do battle for about 2 hours and make no difference. They cannot stop the Albemarle at all. The Albemarle can't get close enough to use its ram, and I guess its shooting was not sufficient to do very much damage to the Federal vessels. At one point, there was a little carrier moving with the Albemarle called the Bombshell, and a Federal ship went over to take it out of action. And when it looked around, it saw that it had a straight shot at about 80 yards, and it decided to ram the Albemarle. So full speed ahead, the Secaucus shoots right at it, full speed ahead. All the men are laying down on the deck. We have eyewitness accounts from a doctor who says it's just a terrifying thing, and it aims to take the Albemarle out. The Albemarle was a flat ship with a thing on top called a casemate in which the guns were located, and the Secaucus was aimed to plow right into the casemate, and it just missed it, and just nudged it, did not dislodge it, ended up sitting on the flat part of the Albemarle, and so the Albemarle just turns its gun around and blasts the heck out of the Secaucus, blows up its boilers, and eventually the ship crawls away, and the battle is disengaged at that point. So the Confederates are thrilled. They think the Albemarle has just proved great, fought 7 ships to a draw, are just impressed as hell. The Union Navy is just destroyed because they don't know what to do, and they are exploring every option available. Can we get some of our own ironclads, the monitors? Can we get them down there? No, they can't get across the sound bar into the sound. Well, can we get the works down here? Can we build one here? No, it just would take too much time. We can't get the equipment. All this kind of. Finally, they conclude that the only thing that we can possibly do is send a suicide mission up there. Go up there and blow the thing up. Admiral Lee, who is Robert E. Lee's cousin, is sitting on his desk. He's looking through reports, and report after report, he's reading about Lieutenant Cushing doing this, Lieutenant Cushing on this raid. Lieutenant Cushing, captures this Confederate officer. He says, "Bring me Lieutenant Cushing." So they work out a little plan. They're going to get Indian rubber boats, going to go up with a bomb and try to blow up the Albemarle. The plan has to get sent to Washington and get personally approved by the Secretary of the Navy. Gideon Welles is not so hot on this idea because he's grown quite fond of Will, and he believes this to be a suicide mission. But eventually he gives his reluctant approval, gives orders for Will to go up to the New York Navy Yard. They get up to the New York Navy Yard, and the guy at the Navy Yard says, "Hey, you don't want Indian rubber boats. You want this great little thing that we have, a picket boat, 35 feet long, got a little cannon in the front, motor in the back. This is really what you want to use. And for the bomb, you want to use this Spar Torpedo that we've got. As I'm sure all you know, it's a torpedo in that sense at the time did not mean the cylindrical thing that we see flying out of submarines, but it was essentially a mine around the bomb. And it was on the edge of 2 wooden spars, and you lower it into the water and it drifts along. And when it gets under the target, you ignite it by pulling a string on it, pulling a firing pin out of it. Fabulous. What are you supposed to do while it's drifting there? Well, you stand there and you wait for the thing to get under the armor. He says, okay, great. He goes out on the Hudson River with a bunch of them one day, tests a bunch. Half of them don't blow up. Half of them the pin breaks. Finally he gets one to work. He says, okay, great, we'll take it. So he sends 2 ensigns back to North Carolina with 2 picket boats. And he goes up to Fredonia to visit his mother. And it's interesting about this whole visit because you see a kind of more melancholy Will than you've ever seen at any other time. He has by this point lost his brother Alonzo at the Battle of Gettysburg, where Alonzo gallantly defended his guns with his last breath. He lost his friend Flusser. He's lost other men in combat. And no one's kidding anybody. This is a suicide mission that he's about to go on. He arrives in Fredonia in high spirits. He's on horseback. He rides the horse into his aunt's kitchen. "Hello, I've come to call," he says. And he makes all his cousins laugh and stuff. But a couple of days go by, he's more melancholy. And he kind of stuns everybody at a little party that's given, where he reaches over and unhooks a locket from a girl who was there, 16-year-old girl. He barely knew her, but he takes a locket from her and puts it around his own neck, which is, for that time and period, is a very intimate gesture and a very personal gesture. And he kind of chuckles. Oh, it's a custom of the old Navy, but it's clear that he's dealing with feelings that he can't quite express. And the next morning, he takes his mother out on a carriage ride, and he tells her all about the upcoming mission. And she, of course, says, "Why you? Why you?" And he says, "Mother, they have no one else." And then they prayed. So he goes back to North Carolina. One of his picket boats has been lost along the way. He says, "That's all right. We'll go up I'll take 12 guys." Somebody convinces him to take another 12 guys in another boat. And he's got the bomb, the torpedo. And I'm convinced that he never intended to use it, that his plan was always to cut out the Albemarle in the old sort of Horatio Hornblower, Captain Aubrey way of landing his vessel, rushing the ship, overcoming the guards. There'd be no crew aboard in the middle of the night. You overcome the guards, you cut the ropes, you steal the ship. You knew that if the Union Navy had nothing that would sink the Albemarle, certainly the Confederates didn't have anything that would sink it either, and he would just sail the ship back down to the Union fleet. They go out on the night of October 26th. Union pickets stop them. The motor's too loud. Everybody can hear it a mile away. They go back, they muffle the motor. They go out again the next night, leave about 11:30 at night, very dark, overcast, raining. You head up the Roanoke River, which is about maybe 40 yards wide. It's overgrown with cypress and gum trees, like a canopy. So everything's very dark, very moody, very misty. They come up after a couple hours, they find the wreck of the Southfield. They expect Confederate pickets to be on there. There are none. He detaches the other boat to stay with the Southfield and to man the Southfield. And he proceeds up, and about a half an hour later, they are outside Plymouth. You can see the hulk of the Albemarle silhouetted, on the riverbank against the sort of small town lights and dying fires of the Confederate troops camped on the riverside. And they get very, very close, and then a dog starts barking. It's good Confederate dogs. And wakes up a sentry. Sentry, who's there? Who's there? Who's there? No reply. Sentry starts shouting and alerts everybody. The camp starts waking up. Well, there goes the idea of cutting the thing out. And shots start firing. Ping, bang, bang. Somebody on the shore lights a huge bonfire that they have built for this very purpose. Turpentine-soaked logs. Whoom, suddenly the whole little basin is ignited. And for the first time, Will can see that the Albemarle is protected by a log boom, which he did not anticipate, but that had been put there by the Confederates for the very purpose of thwarting this kind of attack. Chained logs around protecting the ship. By now, the camp is wide awake. The Albemarle has come awake. A new captain, Captain Worley, is taking charge on the Albemarle. Who goes there? You'll find out soon enough, Will answers. He turns up the engine on the ship. He rides around the log boom, kind of inspects it, looking for any kind of chink or break in the connections. Doesn't really see any. Pulls back out, goes back up the river a bit, turns around, and he now knows that the only thing he can do is try to get that torpedo under the Albemarle. So 4 speed ahead, he rushes the log boom. He hopes to find a space where the two logs are meet, maybe a little bit of weakness and a little give there, that the moss and gook of the river will lubricate his effort to plow right across. He hits them, boom, and he's half right. He gets halfway over, and then he gets stuck. Meanwhile, Captain Worley on the Albemarle is getting the big gun turned around and trying to blow him out of the water. And he's, lower the guns, lower the guns. But Worley's got a problem in that he can't get the barrel of the gun lowered quite low enough. It's the window of the casemate doesn't allow him to depress the gun. Will is just close enough that he can't bring the gun right to barrel. Will begins to lower the torpedo, lower the torpedo. He's all it gradually goes down. It begins to float under. So you got these two men who are both prisoners of physics. Will cannot make the river run any faster than the river current is going, and Worley can't make a thing move any lower than the window casemate will allow. Will is waiting. Worley's yelling. The Confederates on the shore are shooting, shooting, shooting. Bullet creases Will's sleeve. Bullet shoots off his boot heel. Gunfire takes out the back of his jacket. He's just standing on the prow of the boat, waiting, waiting, waiting. Finally, the torpedo dips under the armor. Will pulls the string for the bomb to go off. At the same moment, Worley yells fire, and simultaneously you have these two big explosions that go off. The explosion of the mine sucks the water out. The boat bobs under and throws him back up. Will says he could feel the shot from Worley's gun go right over his head, and nobody really knows what happened. But having done all that he can do, and I guess somewhat surprised to find himself still alive, Will says to his men, every man for himself, abandon ship, and he throws off his coat, and he dives into the water and starts swimming. Captain Worley turns to his chief engineer, says, go down and see what the damage is. The engineer returns in a couple minutes and says, there's a hole down there big enough to drive a carriage through, and 5 minutes later, the Albemarle's on the bottom of the Roanoke. Most of the men with Will get captured. They are just, I imagine they're all concussed by these twin explosions, and most of them were found hanging around the log boom. But Will swam for it, and swam, finally, reaches a riverbank, collapses there a little bit. Next morning wakes up, he finds a black man, presumably a slave, standing over him. He gives him $20. Will gives the man $20 and says, please find out what happened. The man comes back shortly after, and he says, Massa, that ship is dead gone sunk, and if they find you, they're going to kill you. So, word to the wise, Will begins moving on down the riverbank, skulking. He can hear all around him posses out looking for him. He keeps hiding, he keeps moving along. Finally, he comes across a posse that is paying not very much attention to what they're doing, and he steals their boat, which all by itself I think is a pretty amazing thing. Steals the boat out from under these armed men, and he begins rowing, rows for 6 hours till his hands are blistered and about to fall off, reaches Albemarle Sound about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. The Union fleet has no idea really what happened. The men who were on the South Field just left. They heard the explosions. They didn't know what was going on. They assume Cushing and all his men are dead. And what they're really expecting is some sort of Confederate retaliation. So they are alert. They have guards out. They hear this little voice out below the ship called the Valley City. So they send an ensign out to find out what's going on, it being good ensign work. And he goes down there and he finds the bloody, blistered, exhausted Will Cushing sitting in this rowboat. And he said, Cushing, is that you? He says, it is I. He says, is it done? He says, yes, it is done. So he brings Will aboard. They send the message throughout the fleet that the Albemarle has been sunk. And Will Cushing, 21 years old, former expolee from the Naval Academy, has the pleasure of sitting on the deck of the ship with a big brandy and watching the sky light up with rockets sent up from every ship in the fleet in his honor. So that's my man Will. And that's his big event. But it's hardly his only event, and he goes on to fight at Fort Fisher and has many other escapades in the Cape Fear River and a tremendously wonderful adventure in Cuba some years later, and is altogether an amazing action figure. And then he dies at the sadly young age of 32 years old. Otherwise, he was a senior man, and it might have been Admiral Cushing at Manila Bay. It might have been Admiral Cushing with the Great White Fleet. The sky was the limit for him. But that's my story.
Before the mids go to their next class and some of the instructors, I think we probably have time for one or two very quick questions.
Yes, please.
How did he die, sir?
He was diagnosed he had tremendous back pain in the latter years of the Civil War and throughout his post-war service. He was eventually diagnosed as rheumatism of the hip, which is not a diagnosis that we give anymore. So what did he really have? Did he have cancer? Did he have some infection, bone infection? Did he pick up an exotic disease in those swamps or in his Far East service? Nobody ever really knows. It was excruciating. At the very end of his life, he became delirious with pain, and he was the second in command of the Washington Naval Yard at the time, and the nearest hospital, I forget the name of it then, but it's now St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which then and now is a hospital for the mentally ill, and he went there and got some measure of relief from his pain, but died after a couple of weeks. But it gave birth to a whole, legend and construct that Will was actually sort of a madman, that he was a madman in the war, that he conducted himself as only a madman might, and I don't think that was ever really a justified appraisal. But so I don't know quite what killed him, but it was that.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Is in the namesake of the various USS Cushings?
Yes, 6 U.S. naval ships have been named after him, and as I understand, there's another one being contemplated, being named after him, which is a new vessel, littoral combat vessel, which seems appropriate for the kind of work that he did. It seems like a good fit. So write your congressman and if you support that effort. Yes. Yes.
Having an older brother who is an Army officer, is there correspondence or evidence that informed his ability to serve in the Navy?
Several times in that first year of service, he contemplated resigning from the Navy and joining up. It was a real, young man's kind of fantasy about hooking up with your brother. And although he was younger than Alonzo by a year or plus, he was actually the more alpha of the two, and I was always more protective of Alonzo. And he had all these ideas that I would serve with Alonzo and look out for him and watch out for him, which he eventually, I think, relinquished once he, got assigned to Flusser's ship. There's actually 4 Cushing brothers that served. The eldest, Milton, was a paymaster in the Navy, didn't really see any action. The second brother, Howard, was an artilleryman who fought at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chancellorsville, eventually became a lieutenant and took over his brother's battery, then became a cavalryman and of some distinction and died fighting the Apache in Arizona. So it's an amazing military family.
It's good to get to class ready. Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.